When billionaire Beatrice Montgomery discovers her fiancé's family's tangled web of secrets, she risks everything to uncover the truth and mend broken bonds. Together, they must decide, can love and second chances build a foundation strong enough to weather betrayal and loss? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Beatrice Montgomery's penthouse office in downtown Boston. At 42, she had everything most people could only dream of: a thriving real estate empire worth billions, a wardrobe full of designer clothes, and now a handsome fiancé who loved her for who she was, not what she owned. "Miss Montgomery, your 10 o'clock appointment is here," Sarah, her assistant, announced through the intercom. Beatrice smiled, knowing it wasn't really a business meeting. Daniel Parker, her fiancé of 6 months, always found excuses to visit her at work. He walked in wearing his usual construction site attire: jeans, work boots, and a simple button-down shirt. At 38, he ran his own construction company, building homes for working-class families. "You're early," Beatrice said, getting up to kiss him. "Couldn't wait to see you," Daniel replied, pulling her close, "and to talk about meeting my family." Beatrice felt her stomach tighten. After 6 months of engagement, she still hadn't met Daniel's relatives. Every time she brought it up, he changed the subject or made excuses. "They're different," Daniel said, running his hand through his dark hair. "Mom's been through a lot since Dad died, and my brother Greg, well, he has his own issues. Danny, they're your family. How bad could they be?" Daniel's face darkened. "Trust me, you don't want to know." Later that evening, Beatrice sat in her home office, staring at her engagement ring. The 10-carat diamond sparkled under the lights, but something didn't feel right. Why was Daniel so afraid of her meeting his family? She picked up her phone and called her best friend, Linda Thompson. "Linda, I need your honest opinion," Beatrice said. "Am I crazy for wanting to check out Daniel's family before the wedding?" Linda, who'd known Beatrice since college, didn't hesitate. "After what happened with Richard? Honey, you'd be crazy not to." Beatrice winced at the mention of her ex-husband, who'd only married her for her money and nearly bankrupted her company before she caught him cheating. "But Daniel's different," Beatrice protested. "Maybe," Linda agreed, "but you're worth billions, Bea. You need to be sure." That night, as Beatrice lay in bed, an idea started forming in her mind. What if she could see Daniel's family as they really were, without the pressure of being Beatrice Montgomery, the billionaire heiress? The next morning, she called her head of security, Mike Reynolds. "I need a complete background check on the Parker family," she told him. "And I need you to help me create a convincing cover identity." Mike, a former FBI agent, knew better than to argue. "What kind of cover?" "A housekeeper," Beatrice said firmly. "Someone they'd never suspect of being worth billions." Over the next week, Beatrice prepared for her role. She bought clothes from Target and Walmart, learned how to do basic household chores, something she hadn't done since college, and created a backstory for Betty Miller, a widow looking for work. Daniel had mentioned that his mother was looking for household help to prepare for an upcoming family gathering. It was the perfect opportunity. "Mrs. Parker," Beatrice said into her phone, disguising her voice slightly. "I'm calling about the housekeeper position." "Oh yes." Cecilia Parker's voice was sharp and demanding. "Can you start tomorrow? We're having a family dinner, and I need everything to be perfect." "Of course, ma'am." After hanging up, Beatrice looked at herself in the mirror. Her designer clothes were replaced with simple jeans and a plain blouse. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she'd removed all her makeup except for a touch of mascara. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself. Linda's voice echoed in her head. "You need to be sure." That night, Daniel called to cancel their dinner plans. "Mom's insisting on this family dinner tomorrow. I tried to get out of it, but it's fine," Beatrice assured him, feeling guilty about her deception. "We'll catch up later." As she packed her Betty Miller bag for the next day, Beatrice tried to quiet the voice in her head, telling her this was a terrible idea. But she'd been burned before, and she needed to know what Daniel was hiding. The next morning, she parked her old Honda, borrowed from her security team, in front of the Parker family home in Quincy. The house was large but poorly maintained, with peeling paint and overgrown shrubs. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the front door. A woman in her 60s opened it, looking Beatrice up and down with obvious disapproval. "You're Betty Miller? The new housekeeper?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, don't just stand there. There's work to be done." As Beatrice stepped into the house, she had no idea she was walking into a situation that would change her life forever. The perfect world she'd built was about to be turned upside down, and her love for Daniel would be tested in ways she never imagined. The sound of a car door slamming made her jump. Through the window, she saw a man who had to be Daniel's brother Greg getting out of a Mercedes that had seen better days. He was talking angrily into his phone. "I don't care what the bank says," he was saying. "I need that loan. Do you know who my brother is marrying?" Beatrice's heart sank. She'd been right to be suspicious. But just how deep did this deception go? And more importantly, was Daniel part of it? Cecilia Parker wasted no time putting Betty to work. She handed Beatrice a list of tasks that would have made a professional housekeeper cringe. "The silver needs polishing, the floors need scrubbing, and those windows haven't been cleaned in months," Cecilia said, watching Beatrice like a hawk. "And remember, everything must be perfect for tonight's dinner." "Yes, Mrs. Parker," Beatrice replied, fighting to keep her voice humble. She'd run billion-dollar companies, but somehow this woman made her feel like a teenager at her first job. Greg Parker stormed into the house, still on his phone. "Listen, just tell the bank I can guarantee the loan once my brother's wedding goes through. The Montgomery fortune will be connected to our family then." Beatrice's hands froze on the silver she was polishing. She'd suspected something was wrong, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her stomach churn. "Gregory," Cecilia snapped, "not in front of the help." Greg looked at Beatrice dismissively, like she matters, just some cleaning lady. As Beatrice scrubbed floors and dusted furniture, she overheard more conversations that made her blood run cold. Greg and Cecilia spent the afternoon in the kitchen, discussing their plans while Betty worked nearby. "Daniel's always been too soft," Cecilia complained, sipping her third martini of the day. "If it weren't for that bleeding heart of his building those cheap houses for poor people, we could have used his construction company to make real money." "Don't worry, Mom," Greg assured her. "Once he marries Beatrice Montgomery, everything changes. I've already talked to some investors. They're ready to buy into the company once we show them the Montgomery connection. If he ever lets us meet her," Cecilia grumbled. "6 months engaged and we haven't even seen her in person. What's he ashamed of?" Beatrice nearly dropped the vase she was dusting. Daniel hadn't been hiding his family from her. He'd been hiding her from them. The afternoon wore on, and more family members arrived. Aunt Martha, a sharp-tongued woman in her 70s, immediately began criticizing everything from the dust on the bookshelves to Betty's cleaning technique. "In my day," she announced, "servants knew their place and did their jobs properly." Cousin Rachel, a woman about Beatrice's age wearing too much makeup and designer knockoffs, chimed in. "Well, what can you expect from her type? I heard Beatrice Montgomery has a whole staff of professional housekeepers, European ones. And soon we will too," Greg said with a smirk, "once Daniel seals the deal." Beatrice retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she prepared the appetizers Cecilia had demanded. She'd dealt with people trying to use her for her money before, but this was different. This was Daniel's family. The sound of another car pulling up made her heart stop. Through the kitchen window, she saw Daniel getting out of his truck. He looked tired, his shoulders tense as he walked toward the house. "Danny," Cecilia's voice turned syrupy sweet. "You're just in time for dinner." Daniel entered through the kitchen door, stopping short when he saw Betty. For a moment, Beatrice thought he'd recognize her, despite the plain clothes and pulled-back hair. "Mom, you didn't tell me you hired someone new," he said, frowning. "We need help getting this place ready," Cecilia replied, "especially with your wedding coming up. Speaking of which, when are we going to meet this mysterious fiancé of yours?" Daniel's face hardened. "Soon, but Mom, we need to talk about the company. I got a call from the bank today about Greg trying to use my business as collateral for a loan." "Oh, honey, your brother's just trying to help expand the business. Think bigger. With Beatrice Montgomery's connection, stop it, Daniel cut her off. My company stays exactly what it is, building affordable homes for working families. I don't care about the Montgomery fortune. Beatrice's heart lifted at his words, but then Greg spoke up. Don't be an idiot, little brother. You're sitting on a gold mine. That bleeding heart of yours is going to ruin everything. Again. Like you ruined Dad's business? Daniel shot back. Is that why you're so desperate for loans, to cover up more gambling debts? The kitchen fell silent. Beatrice, pretending to arrange appetizers, held her breath. Your father would be ashamed, Cecilia said quietly. He built this family's reputation, and you won't even use your connections to help us maintain it. Dad built houses for working people, Daniel replied. He cared about giving families homes they could afford, not making millions. And look, where that got him, Greg shouted. Dead from a heart attack at 50, leaving us with nothing but debts and a reputation for being small-time builders. Daniel's face went white. Betty, he said suddenly, turning to Beatrice, you can go home. We'll handle dinner ourselves. But before Beatrice could leave, Rachel burst into the kitchen. Danny, you'll never believe what I found. Look at this Society page article about your precious Beatrice. She thrust her phone forward, showing a photo of Beatrice at a recent charity gala. Beatrice froze, certain her cover was blown, but Rachel was too excited about gossiping to look closely at Betty. She looks so stuck up, Rachel sneered. Probably thinks she's too good for this family. Is that why you won't bring her around, Danny? Beatrice watched Daniel's reaction carefully. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment she thought he might finally snap at his cousin. Instead, he took a deep breath. Beatrice is the most down-to-earth person I know, he said quietly. She works harder than anyone in this room, and she cares about helping people, not just making money. That's why I love her. The words hit Beatrice like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on uncovering the family's secrets that she'd forgotten to trust the man she loved. Well, she better be everything you say, Cecilia declared, refilling her martini glass, because this family needs her money, whether you like it or not. The contractors are threatening to sue over Greg's last project, and the bank's about to foreclose on this house. Daniel stared at his mother and brother. What are you talking about? What contractors? What foreclosure? Greg laughed bitterly. I think you're the only one who can run a construction company. I started my own business last year. Used this house as collateral. Things got complicated. You did what? Daniel's voice was deadly quiet. Oh, don't act so high and mighty, Greg snapped. At least I'm honest about wanting to use the Montgomery connection. You're the one pretending to be in love with her, while keeping us all hidden away like dirty secrets. Beatrice had heard enough. She pulled off her apron and headed for the door, but Cecilia's voice stopped her. Where do you think you're going? We're not done here. Beatrice turned slowly, her heart pounding. She had a choice to make, and whatever she decided would change everything. Beatrice stood in the Parkers' kitchen, her hand still on the door handle. The choice before her seemed impossible. Walk away and preserve her disguise, or reveal herself and face the consequences. I said we're not finished, Cecilia repeated, her voice sharp with authority. The dining room still needs to be set up. Actually, Beatrice said, turning around slowly, I think we are finished. Daniel looked at her curiously, something flickering in his eyes. Had he finally recognized her voice? How dare you talk back to me? Cecilia exclaimed. Do you know who we are? Yes, Beatrice replied, reaching up to pull the elastic from her hair. But I don't think you know who I am. The room fell silent as her dark hair fell around her shoulders. She wiped the smudge of cleaning product from her cheek and stood straight, letting her natural, commanding presence return. Oh my God, Rachel whispered, looking from her phone to Beatrice and back again. Oh my God! Daniel stepped forward, his face a mixture of shock and hurt. B, what are you doing here? Finding out the truth, Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Though I'm not sure what's worse, the fact that your family planned to use me for my money, or the fact that you didn't trust me enough to let me meet them. Trust you? Greg laughed harshly. Little brother's been hiding you from us because he's ashamed of his own family. Be quiet, Greg, Daniel snapped. Then to Beatrice, I wasn't ashamed. I was trying to protect you from this. He gestured at the chaos around them. Protect me? Beatrice felt her anger rising. I'm not some delicate flower, Daniel. I'm a businesswoman who's dealt with people trying to use me my entire life. I thought you knew that. I thought you were different. Cecilia had recovered from her shock and was now eyeing Beatrice with calculating interest. Beatrice Montgomery. Well, isn't this a pleasant surprise? Please, sit down. Join us for dinner. We have so much to talk about. Like how you planned. To use my money to bail out Greg's failed business ventures, Beatrice asked coldly. Or how you were counting on my fortune to save this house from foreclosure. Now, dear, Cecilia's tone turned honeyed, you must understand. We're going to be family. Families help each other. Family? Beatrice laughed without humor. Is that what you call this? Lying, manipulating, using each other? You're one to talk about lying, Greg interjected. Coming in here pretending to be a housekeeper? Spying on us? You're right, Beatrice admitted. I did lie, because I needed to know the truth about Daniel's family, and now I do. She turned to Daniel, who hadn't moved or spoken. You should have told me, Danny, about your brother's schemes, about your mother's drinking, about the financial troubles. Did you think I'd walk away? Wouldn't. You? Daniel asked quietly. Look at us, we're a mess. Greg's gambling away everything he touches. Mom's trying to relive the glory days when Dad was alive, and He paused. I'm just trying to hold on to what Dad taught me about honest work and helping people. And you're doing a beautiful job, Beatrice said softly. Your affordable housing projects are changing lives. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. Oh, please, Greg interrupted. You're worth billions and you're impressed by someone building starter homes? Yes, Beatrice replied firmly. Because, unlike you, Greg, your brother understands that true value isn't just about money. It's about making a difference in people's lives. Cecilia set down her martini glass with a sharp click. Very noble sentiments, dear, but let's be practical. This family needs help. Surely as Daniel's fiancé you understand that. What I understand, Beatrice said, is that you see me as nothing but a walking checkbook. But here's something you should know about me. I didn't inherit my fortune. I built it, and I did it by being very careful about who I trust with my money. She walked over to Daniel and took his hand. I trust your son because he's proven himself to be honest, hardworking, and genuinely concerned about others. But you've proven exactly the opposite. Now see here, Greg started, but Beatrice cut him off. No, you see here. I've spent the day watching you plot and scheme, treating me like some prize to be won. Well, I'm not a prize, I'm a person. And if you want any kind of relationship with Daniel and me, things are going to change. Change? Cecilia scoffed. We don't need to change. We're the Parkers. We have a legacy to uphold. Your legacy, Daniel said suddenly, squeezing Beatrice's hand, died with Dad. Ever since then, we've been pretending to be something we're not. But Bee's right. It's time for change. Rachel, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. What kind of change? First, Beatrice said, Greg needs professional help for his gambling addiction, and the house needs to be sold to pay off his debts before he drags everyone down with him. Sold? Cecilia gasped. But this is our home. It's a money pit that you can't afford, Beatrice replied bluntly, and it's filled with memories that are keeping you trapped in the past. She turned to Daniel. You've spent so long trying to protect everyone, trying to live up to your father's legacy. But maybe it's time to let go and build something new. Daniel looked around the kitchen where he'd grown up, at the faded wallpaper and worn countertops. You're right. All of this, it's not honoring Dad's memory. It's corrupting it. How dare you? Cecilia stood up, swaying slightly. After everything I've sacrificed for this family. Mom, Daniel said gently, you need help too. The drinking, the living in the past, it's not healthy for any of us. Greg slumped in his chair, suddenly looking older and tired. So that's it? You're both just going to walk away? No, Beatrice replied. We're offering to help, but on our terms. Real help, not just throwing money at problems. But first, you all need to decide if you're willing to change. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the dusty windows. The perfect family dinner Cecilia had planned lay, forgotten, the expensive ingredients untouched on the counter. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I love you, B, and I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to handle this. You're the strongest person I know." "And I love you," she replied. "But no more secrets, okay? We face things together from now on." Rachel cleared her throat. "So, what happens now?" Beatrice looked around at the Parker family, broken, dysfunctional, but still somehow together. "Now we decide if we're really going to be a family, or just people tied together by old obligations and empty promises." The choice hung in the air, heavy with possibility and potential heartbreak. The perfect world Beatrice had imagined for herself and Daniel was gone, replaced by something messier but perhaps more real. The question was, could they build something better from the ruins of the Parker family's illusions? The morning after the confrontation, Beatrice sat in her office at Montgomery Enterprises, staring at her engagement ring. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind. The phone on her desk buzzed. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Parker is here to see you." Beatrice's heart jumped. "Send him in, Sarah." But it wasn't Daniel who walked through her office. "Sarah Kubas," it was Greg. "Nice office," he said, looking around at the panoramic view of Boston. "Much fancier than our family's old construction company headquarters." "What do you want, Greg?" Beatrice asked, staying seated behind her desk. "Straight to business, I like that." He sat down uninvited. "Look, about last night, I think we got off on the wrong foot." "You mean when I caught you planning to use my money to cover up your gambling debts?" Greg had the grace to look embarrassed. "I prefer to think of it as creative financial planning, but that's actually why I'm here. I have a business proposal for you." Beatrice couldn't believe his nerve. "Are you serious?" "Just hear me out. Your company's always looking for new construction projects, right? Well, I've got connections, high-end clients who'd love to work with Montgomery Enterprises, the same connections that left you in debt and about to lose your family home." Before Greg could answer, Daniel burst into the office. "Greg, what are you doing here?" "Having a business discussion with my future sister-in-law," Greg said smoothly. "Something you should have facilitated months ago, little brother." "Get out," Daniel growled. "Now." Greg stood slowly, straightening his wrinkled suit. "Think about what I said, Beatrice. Family should stick together, right?" After Greg left, Daniel slumped into a chair. "I'm so sorry, B. I should have known he'd try something like this." "How long has he been like this?" Beatrice asked gently. "The gambling? Since Dad died. But the schemes, the manipulation, that's been his whole life." Daniel ran his hands through his hair. "Mom always enabled him, said he was just being ambitious. And you've been cleaning up their messes." "Trying to. But it's getting worse. The contractors Greg mentioned. They're threatening criminal charges over misused funds, and Mom..." He hesitated. "What about your mother?" "She's drinking more. After you left last night, she finished 2 bottles of wine and started talking about how Dad would be ashamed of me for letting the family fall apart." Beatrice walked around her desk and took Daniel's hand. "Your father would be proud of you, Danny. You're the only one still holding onto his real values." "Maybe, but I feel like I'm failing him, and I definitely failed you." He looked up at her. "I understand if you want to call off the engagement." "Is that what you want?" "God, no. But after everything you saw last night..." "What I saw," Beatrice interrupted, "was the man I love trying to protect everyone, even when they don't deserve it. But Danny, you can't save people who don't want to be saved." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's voice on the intercom. "Miss Montgomery? Mrs. Parker is in the lobby. She's causing a scene." Beatrice and Daniel exchanged worried looks before heading to the elevator. When they reached the lobby, they found Cecilia Parker, clearly drunk at 10 a.m. arguing with security. "I demand to see my future daughter-in-law," she was saying loudly. "She owes me an apology for her deception." "Mom," Daniel said firmly, "let's take this somewhere private." "Private, like how you kept this whole relationship private? Ashamed of your own mother?" The lobby had gone quiet, with employees and visitors pretending not to stare. Beatrice took charge. Mrs. Parker, please come up to my office. We can talk there. Oh, now you want to talk? Cecilia swayed slightly. After you came into my home under false pretenses, spied on my family? Mom, please, Daniel begged. Not here. Why not here? Cecilia's voice rose. Let everyone see how the great Beatrice Montgomery treats her future in-laws, sneaking around like a common servant. Security guards were moving closer, but Beatrice waved them off. She stepped forward and spoke quietly but firmly. Mrs. Parker, you have two choices. You can come up to my office and discuss this like adults, or you can be escorted out of the building. Which will it be? Something in Beatrice's tone seemed to reach through Cecilia's alcohol-fueled haze. She straightened up, trying to salvage her dignity. Well, I suppose we should discuss things properly. In the elevator, Daniel whispered, I'm so sorry about this. Beatrice squeezed his hand. Stop apologizing for them, Danny. They're adults, making their own choices. Back in her office, Beatrice had Sarah bring coffee and water. Cecilia sat rigidly on the leather sofa, looking around at the expensive artwork and designer furniture. So this is how the other half lives, she said bitterly, while we're about to lose everything. You're not going to lose everything, Beatrice replied, but changes need to be made. Changes? You mean giving up our family home, abandoning our social position? What social position? Daniel asked quietly. Mom, we haven't been part of that world since Dad died. All we've done is pretend and go deeper into debt trying to keep up appearances. How dare you? Cecilia's hands shook. I've sacrificed everything to maintain this family's status. No, Daniel said firmly. You've sacrificed everything to maintain an illusion. And it's killing you, Mom. The drinking, the denial. I don't have a drinking problem, Cecilia protested, even as she reached for her purse where everyone knew she kept a flask. Beatrice leaned forward. Mrs. Parker, I have a proposition for you. Both Daniel and Cecilia looked at her in surprise. I'm willing to help the family financially, but with conditions. First, Greg enters a gambling addiction program, a serious one, not just a few meetings. Second, you get help for your drinking, real help, including rehab if necessary. And the house? Cecilia asked weakly. The house needs to be sold, Beatrice said gently, but I can help you find a new place, something more manageable, something that could be a fresh start. A fresh start? Cecilia laughed bitterly. At my age. Mum, Daniel said, remember what Dad always said. It's never too late to do the right thing. Tears began to roll down Cecilia's cheeks, smearing her carefully applied makeup. Your father, he would be so disappointed in what we've become. Then let's change, Daniel urged. Not for Dad, not for Beatrice, for ourselves. Cecilia looked at Beatrice through her tears. Why would you help us after what we tried to do to you? Because despite everything, you raised a good man, Beatrice replied, and because I believe in second chances, but this is the only one you're going to get. The office fell silent, except for Cecilia's quiet sobs. Outside, the Boston skyline stretched into the distance, the same view Arthur Parker had once looked at while dreaming of building homes for working families. Now, decades later, his family sat in that same office, faced with the choice between clinging to the past or building a new future. The question was, were they brave enough to change? The real estate office was empty except for Greg Parker and the man sitting across from him. Marcus Wilson, a local loan shark known for his creative business practices, drummed his fingers on the desk. So let me get this straight, Marcus said. You want another loan even though you haven't paid back the first one? This is different, Greg insisted. My brother's fiancée is Beatrice Montgomery. Once they're married, I've heard about that Montgomery woman, Marcus interrupted. Heard she caught you trying to use her money already. Word gets around, Greg. That's why I need the loan now, Greg said desperately. Before she convinces my family to cut me off. Look, I've got a plan. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center, Cecilia Parker was having her first therapy session. She sat stiffly in the comfortable chair, looking around at the certificates on the wall. I want to make one thing clear, she told the therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez. I'm only here because my future daughter-in-law insisted. And how do you feel about that? Dr. Martinez asked. How do I feel? I feel humiliated. The great Cecilia Parker, being forced into rehab like some common drunk. Mrs. Parker, no one is forcing you to be here. You made the choice to come. Cecilia's hands twisted in her lap. Did I have a choice? They're selling my house, my home, everything Arthur and I built. Across town, Daniel and Beatrice were meeting with a real estate agent to look at smaller houses for Cecilia. This one's in a nice neighborhood, the agent said, showing them photos. 3 bedrooms, manageable yard, and it's still close to the city. What do you think, Beatrice? Asked Daniel. Would your mom be comfortable here? Before Daniel could answer, his phone buzzed. The color drained from his face as he read the message. It's Greg, he said. He's done something stupid. At Greg's office, Marcus Wilson was looking over some paperwork. This is a serious proposal, Greg. Using your brother's company as collateral without his knowledge, that's fraud. It's not fraud, Greg argued. I've got power of attorney. Old paperwork from when Danny was in the hospital last year. Never got around to cancelling it. And you think your brother won't press charges when he finds out? He won't, Greg said confidently. Danny's too soft, always has been. But Greg's confidence wavered when Daniel burst into the office, Beatrice right behind him. Power of attorney? Daniel's voice was deadly quiet. You're using my company as collateral? Marcus stood up. I think I'll let you family folks work this out. He headed for the door, pausing beside Beatrice. Miss Montgomery, always a pleasure. Sorry about this mess. After he left, Greg tried to smile. Danny, let me explain. Explain what? How you're trying to steal my company. The company I built from nothing while you were gambling away Dad's legacy. I was trying to save us, Greg shouted. All of us. Mom's in rehab. We're losing the house and you're just letting it happen. No, Beatrice stepped forward. He's trying to help you all start over. But you're so focused on quick fixes and schemes that you can't see it. Greg laughed bitterly. Oh, that's rich coming from you. Born with a silver spoon, never had to struggle. You don't know anything. About me, Beatrice cut him off. My father died when I was 12. My mother remarried a man who tried to steal our company. I fought in court for years to save what my family built. So don't talk to me about struggling. Daniel put a hand on her shoulder, then turned to his. Brother? Greg, this is it, the last straw. Either you get help, real help, or I'm calling the police. You wouldn't. Greg's face went pale. Your own brother? To stop you from destroying yourself and everyone around you? Yes, I would. Just then, Beatrice's phone rang. It was the rehabilitation center. Miss Montgomery, we have a situation with Mrs. Parker. She became agitated during her session and, well, she left, against medical advice. Did she say where she was going? She mentioned something about saving her family's legacy, and she took her car keys before anyone could stop her. Daniel had heard enough of the conversation to understand. Mom's drinking again, isn't she? And she's driving. Beatrice was already calling her security team. Find Cecilia Parker's car, now. Greg slumped in his chair. This is all your fault, he told Beatrice. You came into our lives and turned everything upside down. No, Daniel said firmly. Things were already upside down. We just couldn't see it because we were all falling together. A text came through on Beatrice's phone. They found your mum's car. It's parked at the old Thompson estate. The country club? Greg looked confused. Why would she go there? Daniel closed his eyes. Because that's where Dad had his heart attack. On the golf course, trying to convince investors to save his company. We need to go, Beatrice said. Now. As they rushed to their cars, Greg called out, Wait, what about the loan? Papers? Daniel turned back, his face hard. When we find Mom, you're going to tear up those papers. Then you're going to rehab. Or I swear, Greg, I'll press charges myself. The drive to the Thompson estate was tense. Beatrice tried to focus on the road while Daniel made calls trying to reach his mother's cell phone. She's not answering, he said, his voice tight with worry. She'll be okay, Beatrice assured him, but her own heart was racing. The fancy country club loomed ahead, its manicured lawns and pristine buildings, a monument to the world the Parkers had once been part of. Somewhere on these grounds, a desperate woman was confronting her past, while her sons raced to prevent another family tragedy. But could they reach her in time? And even if they did, could this broken family ever truly heal? The security guard at the Thompson Country Club recognized Beatrice immediately and waved their cars through. The setting. Sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured golf course where Arthur Parker had spent his last moments. "Her car's by the 10th hole," Daniel said, pointing to a silver Mercedes parked haphazardly on the cart path. They found Cecilia sitting on a stone bench near the spot where Arthur had collapsed 15 years ago. An empty vodka bottle lay at her feet. "Mom!" Daniel approached carefully. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for your father," Cecilia slurred, not turning around. "He always knew what to do, always had a plan." Greg stepped forward. "Mom, come on, let's get you home." "Home?" Cecilia laughed bitterly. "We don't have a home anymore. That woman is taking it away." She pointed unsteadily at Beatrice. "Mrs. Parker," Beatrice said gently, "I'm not taking anything away. I'm trying to help." "Help?" Cecilia stood up, swaying. "Like you helped by spying on us? Like you're helping by sending me to rehab and selling my house?" "Mom, please," Daniel begged. "You're drunk. Let us take you back to the center." "I'm not drunk," Cecilia shouted. "I'm finally seeing clearly. Your father built everything for us and we let it all slip away. And now—" She pulled something from her purse, a small revolver. "Jesus, Mom!" Greg stepped back. "Where did— You get that? Your father's gun. He kept it in his study for protection," he said. Her hand shook as she held it. "He was so worried about protecting us. But who protected him when he was dying right here on this golf course?" Daniel took a slow step toward his mother. "Dad had a heart attack, Mom. Nobody could have protected him from that. He was stressed," Cecilia's voice cracked. "Trying to save the company, trying to be everything to everyone, just like you, Danny. And now look at us. Greg's gambling everything. Away, you're marrying a woman who looks down on us and I'm—" She started to cry. "I'm just a drunk old woman who couldn't hold her family together." Beatrice watched Daniel inch closer to his mother. One security guard had arrived and was calling for backup. But they all knew how badly this could end if anyone made the wrong move. "Mrs. Parker," Beatrice said softly, "your husband built something beautiful. Not the company, the family. Daniel tells me stories about how his dad taught him to build things, how he cared about giving people homes they could afford." Cecilia's hand with the gun lowered slightly. "Arthur believed in helping people, said there was no point in being successful if you couldn't make a difference. That's why I fell in love with Daniel," Beatrice continued. "He has that same spirit. When I first met him, he was giving a presentation about affordable housing for seniors. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just cared so much about helping people who reminded him of his dad's first clients. Danny always was like his father," Cecilia whispered. Then her face hardened again. "But you're trying to change him, make him ashamed of us." "No, Mom," Daniel said firmly. "B's the one who made me see that I need to stop enabling everyone's destructive behavior. Dad wouldn't want this for us. He wouldn't want Greg gambling away his future or you drinking yourself to death." "I'm not—" Cecilia's protest was weaker now. "I just need a drink sometimes to cope." "Like I need to gamble?" Greg spoke up. "Mom, Danny's right. We're killing ourselves trying to live up to some image of what we think Dad wanted. But Dad—" His voice broke. "Dad would hate what we've become." Cecilia's hand was shaking harder now. "I see him sometimes when I drink. He's so disappointed." "Then let's make him proud," Daniel said, close enough now to touch his mother's arm. "Let's get help. Real help. All of us." The gun slipped from Cecilia's fingers, landing softly on the manicured grass. She collapsed into Daniel's arms, sobbing. "I miss him so much," she cried. "Every day, I miss him so much." Greg picked up the gun and handed it to the security guard, his own hands trembling. "I need help," he admitted quietly. "I really need help." Beatrice stepped forward and put her arms around both brothers and their mother. For a moment, they all stood there as the sun set over the golf course, holding each other like they hadn't done since Arthur Parker's funeral. Later, at the rehabilitation center, Cecilia sat in her room while Daniel packed away the clothes she'd brought from home. "The house," she said suddenly. The one you and Beatrice were looking at, the smaller one, is it nice? It's perfect, Mom. Just the right size for a fresh start. Your father proposed to me in that house, you know. Our house. On the grand staircase. I know, Mom. But maybe... Cecilia took a deep breath. Maybe it's time to make new memories. In a new place. Down the hall, Beatrice was filling out paperwork to admit Greg to the center's gambling addiction program. He sat beside her, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. I used Danny's power of attorney, he confessed. Could have ruined everything he built. But you didn't, Beatrice replied. Because he stopped you in time. That's what family does, stops you before you go too far. Is that what we are? Greg asked. Family? We're trying to be. A real one, not just people tied together by obligation and old memories. A nurse came to tell them visiting hours were ending. As Beatrice and Daniel walked to their car, she noticed how exhausted he looked. You okay? She asked. No, he admitted. But I will be. We all will be. He turned to her. I'm sorry about the gun. I had no idea Mom still had it. It's not your fault, but Danny... She stopped walking. No more secrets, remember? No more trying to handle everything yourself. He pulled her close. I know. It's just... All my life I've been trying to be the strong one, the responsible one, ever since Dad died. You don't have to be strong alone anymore, Beatrice said. That's what partnership means. As they drove away from the rehabilitation center, the stars were coming out over Boston. Behind them, a mother and brother were starting their journey toward recovery. Ahead of them lay the challenge of building something new from the ashes of the Parker family's past. But for the first time in years, there was hope. Real hope. Not the false kind that comes from denial and pretense. Because sometimes, Beatrice realized, you have to let go of the legacy you thought you had to live up to in order to create the one you were meant to build. 1 month after the incident at the golf course, Beatrice stood in the empty Parker family mansion, supervising the moving company as they packed the last of the furniture. Each room held decades of memories, some beautiful, some painful. Miss Montgomery, one of the movers, held up an old photograph. Where should this go? The photo showed a younger Arthur Parker standing proudly in front of his first construction project, a modest family home. Next to him stood a beaming Cecilia, holding baby Daniel, while a toddler, Greg, played with a toy truck at their feet. I'll take that, said a voice from the doorway. Linda Thompson, Beatrice's best friend, walked in carrying coffee cups. For the memory book I'm making, part of the family therapy program. Since the crisis, Linda had become an unexpected ally, using her skills as a therapist to help the Parker family navigate their recovery. She handed Beatrice a coffee. How's the cleanup going? Almost done, Beatrice sighed, though we found some surprises. Like this. She pulled out a stack of letters from a box. Love letters between Arthur and Cecilia. She never mentioned them. Maybe she couldn't, Linda suggested. Sometimes the sweetest memories are the hardest to face when you're running from pain. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Rachel, Daniel's cousin, looking unusually serious. We need to talk, she said. It's about Uncle Arthur's old business partner, James Wheeler. He's back in town. Beatrice felt a chill. She'd heard stories about James Wheeler, the man who tried to take over Parker Construction after Arthur's death. What does he want? He says he has some old contracts, claims Uncle Arthur owed him money. Rachel twisted her hands nervously. He's threatening to go public with some documents that could hurt Danny's company. At the rehabilitation center, Daniel was visiting his mother when he received Rachel's text about Wheeler. James Wheeler? Cecilia's face went pale. That vulture tried to destroy us once before. What exactly happened with him and Dad? Daniel asked. You never told us the whole story. Cecilia's hands shook slightly, but not from alcohol withdrawal. This time. Your father trusted him. They were building a major development together when things went wrong. What things, Mom? James wanted to cut corners, use cheaper materials. Your father refused, they fought, and then... She closed her eyes. The stress of it all, and that's what caused his heart attack. In another wing of the center, Greg was in a group therapy session when his phone buzzed with the news. He excused himself and found Beatrice waiting in the visitors area. "Wheeler's going to expose everything," Greg said without preamble. "The gambling debts, the fraud attempts, all of it." "How does he know about that?" Greg looked ashamed. "I might have reached out to him before when I was trying to find money." Beatrice fought down her anger. "What exactly did you tell him?" "Everything about Danny's company, about you. I was desperate, okay?" Back at the mansion, Linda was helping sort through more papers when she found something interesting. "B, look at this." She held up an old contract. "The signature dates don't match. If Arthur signed this on March 15th, how could Wheeler have signed it 2 days after Arthur died?" Beatrice's business instincts kicked in. "That's fraud. Wheeler must have forged Arthur's signature on some documents after his death." "Which means," Linda said slowly, "that Wheeler's not just threatening the family. He's trying to cover up his own crimes." At Montgomery Enterprises, Beatrice called an emergency meeting with her legal team. As they discussed strategies, her assistant interrupted. "Miss Montgomery, Mrs. Wheeler is here to see you." An elegant woman in her 60s walked in. "Hello, Beatrice. I'm Margaret Wheeler, and I think it's time you knew the truth about what really happened 15 years ago." Meanwhile, at the smaller house Beatrice had found for Cecilia, Daniel was overseeing the delivery of some furniture when he received an urgent call from an old friend at the city planning office. "Danny, you need to see these papers. Someone's been falsifying building permits using your company's name. And the signatures, they go back 15 years. In his rehabilitation center room, Greg stared at an old photo of his father and James Wheeler. Something about Wheeler's smile had always bothered him, and now he realized why. It was the same smile Wheeler had given him when they discussed using Daniel's company as collateral, the smile of a predator. "I need to make this right," Greg whispered to himself. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for his therapist. "I need to make a confession about everything." Cecilia sat in her therapy session, finally ready to talk about the day Arthur died. "He called me from the golf course," she said, her voice steady. "Said he had proof Wheeler was embezzling from their joint projects. He was going to expose everything. Then," she took a deep breath, "then I heard him gasp and the phone went dead." Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Parker, are you saying your husband's death might not have been just a heart attack?" Back at Montgomery Enterprises, Margaret Wheeler was sharing her own shocking revelation. "James didn't just forge Arthur's signature," she said. "He'd been stealing from their projects for years. Arthur found out and was going to expose him. But James, he knew about Arthur's heart condition. He knew exactly how to push him over the edge." Beatrice felt her blood run cold. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying my husband is responsible for Arthur Parker's death, and I have proof." As the sun set over Boston, the Parker family's past and present were colliding in ways no one could have predicted. The truth about Arthur's death was finally emerging, but with it came dangerous new threats to everything Daniel and Beatrice had built. In her office, Beatrice looked at the photo of Arthur Parker standing proudly in front of his first project. She picked up her phone. "Linda, call everyone. We need to meet tonight. It's time to finish what Arthur Parker started 15 years ago." The question was, how many more secrets would be revealed before justice could finally be served? And could the Parker family survive the storm that was coming? The emergency family meeting was held in Beatrice's penthouse apartment. Outside, a thunderstorm raged over Boston, matching the tension in the room. Cecilia had been granted a temporary leave from the rehabilitation center due to the circumstances. She sat straight-backed on the sofa, her hands clutching a manila envelope. "Before we begin," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years, "there's something you all need to see." She pulled old papers from the envelope. "I found these in Arthur's golf bag the day after he died. I was too drunk to understand what they meant back then." Daniel took the papers, his face growing pale as he read. "These are bank statements showing millions of dollars being transferred from company accounts to offshore holdings." "Wheeler's accounts," Greg added. "He'd been unusually quiet since arriving. I recognize some of these numbers. He showed them to me when he was trying to convince me to help him take over Danny's company. Beatrice watched the family dynamics carefully. Both brothers were stone sober. Their mother was clear-eyed for the first time in years, and even Rachel sat quietly, no gossip or drama for once. Margaret Wheeler stepped forward from where she'd been standing by the window. James had a pattern. He'd find successful family businesses, become a trusted partner, then slowly drain them dry. Arthur was the only one who caught him. "And it cost him his life," Cecilia whispered. Linda, who'd been taking notes, spoke up. "But why come back now after 15 years? "Because of me," Beatrice realized. "My engagement to Daniel was in all the business papers. Wheeler must have seen it and realized the Montgomery fortune could save the Parker name," Daniel finished. "But he didn't count on us already dealing with our problems, or on me turning against him," Margaret added. She pulled out her own papers. "These are copies of everything. The forged documents, the proof of embezzlement, and—" She paused. "The text messages he sent the day Arthur died, bragging about pushing him over the edge." The room fell silent except for the thunder outside. "Why are you doing this?" Greg asked Margaret. "Turning on your own husband?" Margaret's face hardened. "Because I watched him destroy families for 30 years. I kept quiet, told myself it was just business. But Arthur, he was different. He cared about people, about building homes they could afford. And James killed him for that." Suddenly, Beatrice's phone buzzed. A text from her. "Security team. Wheeler spotted entering Parker construction office." "He's making his move," Daniel said, reading over her shoulder. "Probably trying to get to the original documents before we can expose him." "Let him," Beatrice said firmly. "My security team will handle it. Right now we need to focus on getting these papers to the district attorney." "No," Cecilia stood up. "First, we need to do something else, something Arthur would have wanted." Everyone looked at her in surprise. "Mom?" Daniel asked gently. "What are you thinking?" "Your father died trying to protect affordable housing for working families. Wheeler's been destroying that dream for 15 years. She turned to Beatrice. "You have the power to make it right." Beatrice understood immediately. A foundation, in Arthur's name, dedicated to building affordable housing. "And preventing predatory development," Daniel added, catching the vision. "Using Montgomery resources and Parker construction expertise." "That's all very touching," a cold voice said from the doorway. James Wheeler stood there holding a gun, with Beatrice's security guard lying unconscious behind him. "Really, Margaret," he said to his wife, "after all these years, you choose now to grow a conscience?" "It's over, James," Margaret replied. "I sent copies of everything to the FBI an hour ago." Wheeler's face contorted with rage. "You think that matters? I've spent 15 years building a new empire. I've got judges in my pocket, politicians, on my payroll." "And nothing to show for it," Cecilia interrupted, standing tall. "Look at you, James, still sneaking around with a gun, still trying to steal what others have built. Arthur saw through you 15 years ago, and we see through you now." "Shut up," Wheeler's hand shook. "You're just a drunk old woman who couldn't keep her family together." "No," Daniel stepped in front of his mother. "She's a woman who's facing her demons, unlike you. Step aside, Danny boy, this is business. This stopped being business the day you killed my father." Wheeler laughed harshly. "Killed him? I just applied pressure. His weak heart did the rest." "And you just confessed to it?" Beatrice said calmly, holding up her phone. "On a live stream to the district attorney's office." Wheeler's face went white. He swung the gun toward Beatrice, but Greg was faster. He tackled Wheeler just as the police burst through the door, responding to the silent alarm Beatrice had triggered. As the police led Wheeler away, the family huddled together, shaking but united. "Dad would be proud," Greg said quietly. "Of all of us." "Even me?" Rachel asked. She'd been filming everything on her phone. "I sent the video to every news station in Boston." Daniel laughed and hugged his cousin. "Especially you, finally putting your gossip skills to good use." Later that night, after the police had gone, and statements had been taken, Cecilia stood on Beatrice's balcony, looking out at the city. "I was wrong about you. she told Beatrice. "I thought you were trying to change our family, but you were trying to save it." "Your family saved itself," Beatrice replied. "You just needed someone to believe you could." "The foundation," Cecilia said. "Arthur's dream. You'll make it happen." "We'll make it happen, all of us, together." Inside, Daniel was on the phone with the rehabilitation center, arranging for his mother's return. Greg sat with Linda, discussing how to incorporate this trauma into his recovery journey. Rachel was giving her statement to a reporter, for once telling a story that needed to be told. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was breaking over Boston. A new day was beginning for the Parker family, not the one Arthur had imagined 15 years ago, but perhaps the one he had always hoped they'd find, a day of truth, redemption, and real love. But as Wheeler was led into his holding cell, a cold smile played on his lips. He had one more card to play, a secret so devastating it could tear the Parker family apart just when they thought they were finally whole. 3 days after Wheeler's arrest, life was starting to settle into a new normal. Cecilia had returned to rehabilitation with renewed determination. Greg was making progress in his recovery program, and Daniel and Beatrice were finally focusing on their upcoming wedding. Then the letter arrived. "It's from Wheeler's attorney," Beatrice told Daniel as they sat in her office. "He says Wheeler has information about your father that could change everything. He's desperate," Daniel said, "trying to bargain his way out of prison." But Linda, who'd become the family's unofficial counselor, wasn't so sure. "Wheeler's too smart to bluff without cards to play. Maybe we should hear what he has to say." At the county jail, Wheeler sat across from them in the visitor's room, his expensive suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit. "I wondered how long it would take you to come," he said, smiling that cold smile. "Did you bring what I asked for?" Beatrice placed a recorder on the table. "Start talking." "First, my terms. I want a deal with the DA. 20 years instead of life." "That depends on what you're offering," Linda replied. She'd come along as a neutral observer. Wheeler leaned forward. "Tell me, Danny boy, did you ever wonder why your father trusted me so much? Why he made me your godfather?" Daniel's face showed surprise. "You were never my godfather." "No?" Wheeler pulled out an old photograph. It showed him holding a baby, standing next to Arthur and a much younger Cecilia. "This says different." "What's your point?" Beatrice demanded. "My point is that Arthur and I were more than business partners. We were like brothers until you killed him," Daniel snapped. "No," Wheeler's smile widened, "until I found out he was sleeping with my wife." The room went silent. "You're lying," Daniel said, but his voice wavered. "Am I? Margaret was quite beautiful back then. And Arthur, well, he had a weakness for beautiful things he couldn't have." "Stop it," Linda interrupted. "Unless you have proof, this is just cruel manipulation." Wheeler pulled out an envelope. "DNA test results from 15 years ago. Want to guess what they say, Danny?" Daniel's hands shook as he took the envelope. "I found out just before Arthur died," Wheeler continued. "Confronted Margaret. She admitted everything. That's when I decided to destroy him, not for the money, for the betrayal." "Did my mother know?" Daniel asked quietly. "Cecilia? No, she was too drunk most of the time to notice anything, but I knew. Every time I looked at you, I saw Margaret's eyes looking back at me." Beatrice grabbed Daniel's hand. "Don't listen to him. He's trying to manipulate you." But Daniel was already opening the envelope. His face went pale as he read. "It's true," he whispered. "The DNA. I'm not Arthur Parker's son." Wheeler sat back, satisfied. "Now you know why I really came back. Not for money, for revenge. Against Margaret, against Arthur's memory, and against you, the living proof of their betrayal." Linda took the test results, studying them carefully. "These could be forged, like the contracts." "Check them yourself," Wheeler shrugged. "The lab still has the records. I made sure of that." Daniel stood up abruptly and walked out. Beatrice started to follow, but Linda stopped her. "Let me talk to him first. This is beyond business now." Back at Montgomery Enterprises, Beatrice paced her office, waiting for news. Finally, her phone rang. It was Margaret Wheeler. I saw James's attorney filed the DNA results with the court, Margaret said without preamble. I suppose I owe you all the truth. Did you love Arthur? Yes, but not the way James thinks. Arthur knew I was trapped in an abusive marriage. He helped me get away, gave me money to start over. But James found me, forced me to come back. And Daniel? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Daniel is Arthur Parker's son. Those DNA results are forged, just like everything else James touches. Can you prove it? Yes, because I kept Arthur's real DNA test from back then. He wanted to be sure, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to protect Daniel from exactly this kind of attack. At the rehabilitation center, Cecilia was in a family therapy session when Daniel burst in. Is it true? He demanded. Did you know about Dad and Margaret? Cecilia looked confused. What are you talking about? As Daniel explained Wheeler's claims, Cecilia's face went from confused to angry. That bastard, she said softly. He's still trying to destroy our family. Danny, listen to me. Your father never betrayed us. Margaret was like a sister to me. We helped her escape James, but she wouldn't testify against him. He's twisted everything to hurt us one last time. But the DNA test... Look at yourself in the mirror, Cecilia said firmly. You have your father's chin, his hands, his heart. No test can change that. Greg, who joined them from his own therapy session, spoke up. Remember how Dad used to say blood isn't what makes a family? Maybe that's what he meant. No, Cecilia shook her head. Your father said that because he believed family is about love, not genetics. But Danny, you are Arthur Parker's son, in every way that matters, and yes, by blood too. Just then, Beatrice and Linda arrived with Margaret. Show him, Margaret said, handing Daniel another envelope. The real test results from when you were born. Daniel read them slowly, tears forming in his eyes. Wheeler forged the new results, Beatrice explained. Just like he forged Arthur's signature. He thought he could destroy your father's legacy by making you doubt everything. But he failed, Linda added, because Arthur's legacy isn't in DNA or documents. It's in the lives he touched, the homes he built, the family he loved. Daniel looked around at his family, his mother strong in her recovery, his brother fighting his demons, his fiancé who had helped them face the truth, and the others who had become part of their story. Wheeler's last secret, he said quietly. It was never about destroying Dad's business legacy. It was about destroying his real legacy, us. Cecilia stood up and hugged her son. Your father used to say that the truth always comes out in the end, but he also said that when it does, what matters isn't the secret itself, but how we heal from it. As the family embraced, Beatrice's phone buzzed with a news alert. Wheeler had been found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. His final attempt to destroy the Parkers had failed, and now he was gone. But his last secret had done something he never intended. Instead of tearing the family apart, it had brought them closer together, stronger in their truth and their love. The question was, what would they build on this new foundation of honesty and healing? 6 months later, the garden of Beatrice's summer estate was transformed for her wedding to Daniel. White roses lined the pathway to a simple wooden arch, built by Daniel himself, using his father's old tools. In a room upstairs, Cecilia helped Beatrice with her veil. Her hands were steady now, her eyes clear after completing her rehabilitation program. Something borrowed, Cecilia said, pinning a pearl brooch to Beatrice's dress. Arthur gave this to me on our wedding day. I want you to have it. Mrs. Parker, I couldn't... Please, Cecilia smiled. Call me Mom. And yes, you can. You're the daughter I never had, the one who helped save our family. There was a knock at the door. Greg entered, looking healthy and confident in his tuxedo. 6 months of recovery had changed him profoundly. The guests are arriving, he announced, and wait until you see what we did with the reception area. The we meant Greg's new construction company, a division of Parker Construction focused on renovating historic properties. Daniel had trusted his brother with the project as part of his recovery, and Greg had thrown himself into it with newfound passion. How do I look? Beatrice asked nervously. Like a Montgomery, Greg grinned. but with a Parker heart. Meanwhile, in another room, Daniel stood with Linda, adjusting his tie. "Nervous?" she asked. "About marrying B?" "Never. About the announcement." "We're making it the reception?" "A little." The announcement was their biggest secret, the launch of the Arthur Parker Foundation for Affordable Housing, with an initial endowment of $50 million from Montgomery Enterprises. "Your father would be proud," Linda said. "Of all of you." "Even Rachel," Daniel laughed, referring to his cousin who had surprised everyone by enrolling in business school, inspired by Beatrice's example. "Especially Rachel. She's already lined up 10 corporate sponsors for the foundation's first project." The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. As Beatrice walked down the aisle, she passed faces that told the story of their journey. Margaret Wheeler, now working with domestic violence survivors, Sarah, Beatrice's assistant who had become family, the construction workers from Daniel's company, and even some of Greg's recovery group friends. At the altar, Daniel took Beatrice's hand. Their vows weren't just promises to each other, but to the legacy they would build together. "When I first met you," Daniel said, "I thought I had to protect you from my family's problems. Instead, you showed us how to face them together." "And when I first met you," Beatrice replied, "I thought I had to pretend to be someone else to understand your world. Instead, you taught me that real love only happens when we're truly ourselves." At the reception, Cecilia stood to make her speech. The gathered guests fell silent, many remembering her drunken appearances at past society events. "A year ago," she began, "I was lost in grief and guilt, trying to preserve a legacy I didn't understand. My son Daniel tried to protect me. My son Greg tried to save me with schemes and shortcuts. But it took someone from outside our family to show us what Arthur's legacy really meant." She turned to Beatrice. "My late husband believed that a home wasn't just a building, it was a foundation for dreams. Today we're not just celebrating a marriage, we're celebrating the rebirth of that dream." Greg stood next. "The Arthur Parker Foundation isn't just about building houses, it's about building second chances. I know something about those." He smiled at his recovery group friends. "Dad used to say that everyone deserves a home they can be proud of. Now we're making sure everyone gets a chance to be proud of themselves, too." The announcement of the foundation was met with thunderous applause, but the biggest surprise came when Rachel took the microphone. "As the foundation's new director of corporate relations," she said, causing Daniel to choke on his champagne, "I'm proud to announce our first project. We're converting the old Parker mansion into a transition home for recovering addicts and their families." Cecilia wiped away tears as she hugged her niece. The house that had been a symbol of their decline would now be a place of healing for others. Later, during their first dance, Daniel held Beatrice close. "Remember when you pretended to be a housekeeper?" he whispered. "Seems like a lifetime ago," she replied. "We've come so far." "We still have far to go," he said. "The foundation's just the beginning." "I know, but now we have something your father always wanted, a family strong enough to carry his dream forward." As they danced, Beatrice looked around at their guests. Cecilia was teaching some of Greg's recovery friends proper ballroom steps. Rachel was networking with potential donors, her gossip skills turned to good use. Greg was discussing renovation, plans with a group of contractors, his old gambling buddies replaced by honest business partners. The sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, cranes from Parker construction sites dotted the horizon, each one representing a future home for a family in need. "You know what Dad used to say about sunsets?" Daniel asked softly. "What?" "He said they're not really endings, just the beginning of a new day somewhere else." Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. He was right. This isn't the end of our story. It's just the beginning. As if to prove her point, Cecilia clinked her glass of sparkling cider and called for attention. "One last surprise," she announced. "The board of the foundation has chosen its first executive director." She smiled at Linda. "Someone who helped us all find our way home." Linda's eyes widened in surprise as the crowd applauded. Another piece falling into place, another part of their extended family finding its purpose. The party continued into the night, but Beatrice and Daniel slipped away to a quiet corner of the garden. The wooden arch he'd built framed the starlit sky behind them. "Ready for our next chapter?" she asked. "With you? Always." Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky. A final blessing from Arthur Parker, perhaps, for the family that had lost its way but found something greater. The truth that love like home isn't about perfect appearances or grand facades. It's about having the courage to knock down old walls, clear away the debris of the past, and build something new. Together. The end.